Jonah chapter 3. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, "Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I tell you." So Jonah set out and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days' walk across. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's walk, and he cried out, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." And the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. When God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity, and he said that he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Second reading is from Mark chapter 1. Now after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God, and saying, "The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news." As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. As he went a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee and went into the boat with the hired men and followed him.
So I'm looking around the room today, and my mind's eye, I'm seeing the people sitting in the pews in Pinoca too, and I'm thinking to myself, how many of you could be ministers? Laughing? Why are we laughing?
Something you want trying to tell us?
Yep. So I know I've said to people, but I won't name any names, and I'm trying not to look at anyone as I say this, but there are many people in both our congregations. There's many people not in both our congregations who could be great ministers. And let me say it a little differently, because of course we are the priesthood of all believers, right? We're all ministers. That's part of our tradition, is that we are literally all ministers, because we are all responsible for Jesus' ministry to everyone. But from that, we have a small select group of highly trained individuals who are incredibly gifted and do amazing things. So that's me. No, that's not me. But that is what we have. We have a smaller group of people who do things. And then we have a smaller group of that do very specific things. And we call them various orders of, we call it order of ministry in the United Church. Which I've often thought in the Protestant traditions that having ministers, rather than say pastors or priests, that language is confusing, because we're all ministers, which is great, because that means I'm a minister, you're a minister, we're all ministers. I just get to put a capital M at the beginning of mine. And then, well, how do you designate the person who's separate? The minister of the ministers. And we use language like order of ministry personnel, which sounds very official and everything, but basically that just means that at some point I may have had a little bit more training than some of you, and I get paid to, oh wait, never mind. So the thing about that is that it means that there's a little select group of people who are educated to be leaders, basically. Right? We're trained in various ways to do different things, but the role is about leadership. This is really important, because that's what these stories today are about. They are. They are quite specifically about specific people being called to a specific task. Jesus calls the first disciples because they're the ones he's going to train to be the leaders. That's who he's looking for. And so you might think to yourself, so he's going to be looking for gifted theologians, people with incredible leadership skills, people who speak well in public. And apparently Jesus has incredibly low standards, and he goes to fishermen. Not that there's anything wrong with fishermen. Fishermen are great people. They're fine people, wonderful people. But in the day, he might as well have gone to shepherds, because that's what people would have thought in the day. He did not pick gifted preachers or rabbis or intellectuals. He picked ordinary people. So right away, let's be clear that while the story is specifically about Jesus specifically calling specific people to do specific tasks, he calls people that you would not necessarily think would be gifted for that task. As if somehow Jesus knows something we don't know. I'll come back to that in a second. But hang on, because it's not just about that. Though there are, once again I'll just mention, many of you sitting in the room in both Bashaw and Pinoka who could be ministers, capital M, ministers. But it's not specifically just about that at all, is it? Because it's a story about how Jesus calls to all of us in our own way, whether we're fishermen or not. Jesus calls to us in our own way. And that's a key part of this story. Because while some of you might very well be great order of ministry personnel, some of you might also be just really great people sitting in a pew. Because that's also the people who, as I said earlier, since we're all ministers, do ministry in our lives, right? It's part of what we do. We are called to minister in our lives. That's part of what following Jesus is about. It's not just feeling good about ourselves. It's about how we share that with other people and how we minister to other people as well. Are we confused yet? Okay, I'll try harder. The thing is, we make this story so simple, and it's not. We make this story into a story of Jesus goes to the lakeshore, he says, "Follow me," and they drop everything, and I believe it actually says, immediately, they dropped everything and followed him. I feel sorry for Zebedee if you're going to hear the story that way. I feel sorry for Zebedee, first of all, because his name is Zebedee, but secondly, because his kids go, "Oh, okay," and off they go, and he's sitting in the boat going, you're going to just leave me with the paid guys? You're my kids. Wouldn't you feel bad for Zebedee? I would, if that's how the story went, and it's not. But I'd feel bad for him if it is. But we've traditionally heard this story that way. That's why so many people, if you ask somebody who is in order of ministry personnel, if you ask somebody what their call story is, some people will say, "I heard a voice that spoke to me and said, and I went and followed." I'm sure there are some. The vast majority of us will go, "Well, how long you got?" Because it took a while. Ran away for a bit, came back, took a while. And let's be real, not everybody thinks I should have been a minister, and, so it's kind of a long story. That's usually how it goes. It's more like Jonah, in fact. The story of Jonah, right? Jonah, we only heard the little piece that's about what Jonah actually said, or was told to go and say by God to the people in Nineveh, and what happens as a result of that. But we're quite familiar with the story of Jonah, actually, because it's the one with the fish, right? Jonah is called by God. Jonah, of course, says no and runs away. And he ends up on a boat. God brings a storm. So Jonah tells the guys to throw him overboard. He ends up being swallowed by a fish that then rather graphically barfs him up on the seashore. And finally, Jonah gives in and says, "Okay, I'll go. I'll do what you want." And then he goes to Nineveh. He does that. The people respond rather dramatically and change their ways, and God changes God's mind. Surprise. And then Jonah goes, "What the heck? I want to see this city destroyed." That's what happens next in the story. God says, "Okay, good job, everybody. We're good." And Jonah literally goes, "No, you said, go and do it. I want that city destroyed." Jonah doesn't sound like a good minister to me. And yet, of all the prophets, depending on how you perceive what the role of a prophet is, Jonah is the most successful of all the prophets. He went to Nineveh, prophesied their doom to them, and they changed their ways, and they were not destroyed. How often do you hear that? Usually the prophet goes, doom and gloom, doom and gloom, doom and gloom. Then there is doom and gloom. That's how you know they're a prophet, because it happens. And yet, here's Jonah. He goes and he tells them what God says to tell them, and they actually change their ways. So God changes God's mind. Good job, people of Nineveh. Good job, Jonah. What do you mean, good job? But yes, good job, Jonah. Maybe that didn't turn out the way Jonah thought it was going to turn out, or anybody else for that matter, but still, good job. So I know you've heard me, probably some of you have heard me say this like too many times now, but one of my favorite characters in the Bible has always been Saul. That's the Saul who becomes Paul, the Apostle Paul. Not because of all the things Paul did, but because I figure if God could do that with somebody like Saul, I should be easy. So here's Jonah, literally saving a city and being mad about it. What? That's some kind of ministry right there. And here's the story. Then we follow that with this story from Mark, where Jesus goes to the lake shore and he says, follow me, and they literally drop everything and immediately follow him. Hang on, though. That's always how we describe that story, and it's not how it goes. That's not how the story goes. How the story goes is, Jesus came to Galilee and began his ministry. He began preaching the good news. He began calling people, and notice, you might notice that the language is quite familiar here because it's exactly the same language that we use to describe what John the Baptist does. He calls people to turn from their wickedness and repent. The kingdom of God is near. In other words, he'd already started his ministry before he finds the first disciples. So, actually, the story I told the kids is not really all that imaginative. He'd already started his ministry. He was probably finding it was a lot of work. I need helpers. So he goes and looks for helpers. I have a feeling that Mark left out a few verses, and those were the verses where Jesus went to bakers and said, follow me. And they said, no, I'm busy. Or Jesus went to gardeners or farmers and said, follow me. And they said, no, I'm busy. Jesus went to the fishermen and said, and they said, no, I'm busy. Well, hang on. What if I were to say, here's what we're going to do. You can be basically doing what you're doing, maybe without all the backbreaking labor and everything, but you can help me help people. Okay. We always interpret that story as, we start with Jesus goes and says, follow me, and they drop everything and do. I have even preached on that and said, I think what happens is that Jesus knows them. Because Jesus is of God, Jesus knows them, and so he quite specifically goes to certain people, and he picks those people because he knows them. And they follow because they know Jesus. I know somebody has a really interesting way of seeing this whole life journey. This is just a slight aside here. You'll see how it's relevant. But your whole life journey has already been determined for you, because before you came here, when you were with God, you discussed it with God, sorted it out, and chose your journey. How you then follow that path in this life is up to you, and how people interact with you obviously changes the journey or affects the journey. But essentially, you have picked your path before you came here. Okay, if that were true, then Jesus would know their path and would know who to go to. You see how that works? That works. That's great. That's awesome. And that is entirely possible. I'm not saying that's not a good way of seeing that. It's also just a really good way of seeing this as, it's Jesus. And if Jesus were to walk in the room right now and go, follow me, we'd all be out the door with Jesus, wouldn't we? Because it's Jesus. No, we wouldn't. That's the problem with that interpretation, is we know it's Jesus because we have 2,000 years of these stories of Jesus, and we can go, yep, that's Jesus, all right. Although, frankly, if Jesus were to walk in the room right now, we would probably not recognize Jesus. But still, we do that and can say that because we already know Jesus. The first disciples would not have. I'm still calling them disciples, right? Those guys who were fishing wouldn't have known Jesus, would they? Hang on. Remember, the story begins with Jesus was already about his ministry. He was already doing stuff. It's entirely possible that the first disciples, I can't stop calling them that, the first disciples actually did know Jesus. They might have heard him preaching. Zebedee might have been thrilled that his sons had chosen to give up this back-breaking labor of being a fisherman their whole life to go and help people with Jesus. Why not? It says Jesus was about his ministry. Why wouldn't we see the story that way? Why would we simply want to interpret that story as the power of Jesus? I was about to say it. I read a blog this week. This is one of the things this week. I read a lot of blogs. And somebody had written a blog about this story in which their assertion was that indeed it was just the power of Jesus. And they phrased it as the power of Jesus compelled them. Now I know some people recognize the word right away. The power of Jesus compels you are words from exorcism. They're the words of exorcism is what they are. Now I know many of you are probably familiar with those. I'm just kidding. Of course not. It's the only way we often know those words is because we've seen them, we've read them in a book, or we've seen them in a story, or on TV or in a movie or something, right? It's the power, I think it's actually the power of Christ compels you. And I thought, wow, man, you're using the words of exorcism to describe Jesus calling people to him. Don't you think the words Jesus would have used would have been words like, come and help me help people? Don't you think that Jesus, from our vantage point even, of 2,000 years of knowing Jesus, don't you think the Jesus we know would have said something more along the lines of, you're an awesome person. You can help people. I can show you how. Come and help me do that. And when you immediately go, no, I can't. Jesus would probably go, yes, you can. Yes, you can. You know all this stuff I've been doing? I've been talking to people. I'm a carpenter's son, by the way. Look at what I've been doing and see how I've been helping people. I can help you do that too. You can do that. Yes, you can. It's just like being a fisherman. Really. It is. Honestly. Because it's really just, it's about you. You throw yourself into your work. In fact, you're like a fifth or sixth generation fisherman, right? So really it's your life. It's been your family's life. It's your life. I can make that life be more rewarding, not only for you, but for people. Come and follow me and I'll show you how. And see, that's where I know I've said how much I love the story in John's Gospel more, because that's the one where the first disciples themselves actually go to Jesus because they want to find out what he's doing. And he says, come and see. I'll show you. And they end up following him because they come and see. But really, isn't this the same kind of story? They might readily have had a chance to see Jesus doing what he does before he came to them and said. And for all we know, Jesus might have been sort of looking around thinking, I need some guy, that guy's, I'm going to come back and talk to him. We read this story, and it just, Mark is the bare bones gospel anyway, right? Mark is like right to the point, here it is. And Mark's point was, the power of Jesus compels you, I think. It probably was. But tell me, in the 21st century, in 2018, I didn't want to sound like anybody else just then, but in this day and age, tell me that works. Because it doesn't. Because you look around at who our leaders are right now. Look around at who our leaders are right now. And sure, you might find a few that really fall into this model like Jesus kind of a thing. Sure, you might. But the leaders of most of the countries in the world are not like that. We got a prime example to the south. I'm not going to say his name, but you know who I'm talking about. But he's not the only one. He's not the only one. The personal charisma of somebody, how they look in a photo. Yep, I said it. How they look in a photo sometimes makes a difference. What they can say versus what they do definitely makes a difference. But we follow people often without doing that sort of due diligence or discernment of finding out really what they're about. What's at the heart of what they're doing? Where are they leading us? So I think if you read this story and you go, the power of Jesus simply compels you, I think you might want to think about that a little bit more. Because sometimes there's more to it than that. There's being able to see what that power is. There's being able to understand what that power is about and where that power is taking you. And that's in this story. It actually is. Jesus was about doing what he does. We often read in stories in the Bible, in the Gospels, we often hear about stories that end with things like, and something along the lines of, and Jesus' fame grew around the countryside. People started flocking to Jesus because they'd heard about him. So why would it be so hard to believe that the disciples had actually, those fishermen had actually already heard of Jesus and found out? They already knew something. And then, when they did follow Jesus, they would have found out more. So first of all, Jesus calls the people, and you know he would have been looking around for people that could have been leaders. And here's the part that's even more important than the fact that they were fishermen. They could have been bakers, they could have been farmers, they could have been anybody. They could have been anybody, because that wasn't what Jesus was really looking for, was it? He was looking for the person, what was in their heart, and how that would be part of things. So Jesus is looking for leaders. We're always looking for leaders, by the way. So again, I'm not going to look at anybody in particular in the room, but at least half of you could be ministers. You truly could. Remember too, that it doesn't necessarily mean being a minister doesn't mean you have to stand up in front of people and make sure that you keep an eye on the clock to see that you haven't talked for too long. Sometimes it's about doing pastoral care. Sometimes it's about education. There's a minister downstairs right now leading children, right? One of our, Holly did ministry today by reading. Mary Ellen did ministry by greeting. The people who made food today, bless you, did ministry. We are the church of food. I know, I say that sometimes, and people start to get annoyed with me when I say that, because the thing is, it's not funny. And criticize us all you want, but I'm not meaning to be funny. We are the church of food. Yay. Partly because, look at my shape, but also partly because how many stories do you know about Jesus where, in fact, this is going to be one of the few stories where Jesus doesn't say, come and have food with me and we'll talk about it. He probably actually did. Follow me. Okay. Well, let's go and get a bite to eat first and we'll talk about this. Because there's just loads of stories of Jesus sitting down to eat with people. Why? Well, because that's a moment in which we have engagement over food. It's a thing we all have to have. We all have to have, right? Not beets, but we all have to have good food, and we share it with each other. And in that sharing, we also have an opportunity for dialogue. We also have an opportunity for engagement. We have an opportunity to talk about politics, religion, and sex at the dinner table. You don't remember being told not to talk about those things? When I was a kid, I was told not to talk about those things at the dinner table. No, you can talk about anything at the dinner table. That's why you have it. It's an opportunity to have that moment. So here's how I think this story went. I think Jesus was doing his thing, decided he needed help. He was looking around, and as he was doing his thing, he was just keeping an eye on a few people, and then at the end of the day, he thought, okay, let's see, there was I got a short list of 8. I'll go back and I'll talk to these 4 guys. I know there's these 2, they're in the same place, they're all fishermen, I'll go talk to them. And went back and said, hey, Come on. Do you want to come and do what I do and help people? And by the way, it will help you too. And okay, let's talk about it. We'll have some food, we'll talk about it. And they went and had a bite to eat, they talked about it, and the next day they're off. And Zebedee is going out to the boat with the guys he pays to work with him, going, I'm so proud of my sons. Look what they're doing. That's how I think the story went. If the story for you goes, I heard a voice call to me and I followed, that's okay. You absolutely can. There are people who do. You should still check that voice. You should check it out. You should still ask questions. Jesus never told anyone not to ask a question. You should still keep your eyes wide open as to where you're going. And you should ask questions the whole way. The one other thing about this story, that interpretation of the power of Jesus compels you, that's always bothered me a little bit, is that's not how Jesus works. It's not how Jesus works. That's not entirely true. That is exactly how Jesus works when we're reading stories about how Jesus casts out a devil. Ironically, the moments of exorcism, that is how Jesus works. I command you, get out. Sorry, I didn't mean to point at you, Mary Ellen. Sorry. That was an accident. That's the only time we ever hear Jesus use that kind of commanding power. It's to stand up to something that we might perceive as evil or wrong, or to fix something. Everything else is about Jesus sharing power with us. In fact, the power that's in all of us, which is the power to care for people and to love people. It's the power to help, the power to heal. That's what Jesus is calling these guys to. That's what Jesus calls all of us to. We are called to different ways of expressing that. Sometimes we are called to express that in order of ministry. Sometimes we're called to do that just with our next door neighbor or some guy we run into on the street. So today, first of all, please always remember that the first followers of Jesus were called not with a voice of command, but with a voice of invitation to come in and be part of what I'm about, Jesus says. Secondly, I expect to see at least half of you want to talk to me this week about information about learning more about going into ministry. Order ministry. The church needs ministers, and so we'll need to get on that this week. The power of Jesus compels you. No, I thought I'd give it a shot. It was just worth a shot there. We are all called. You don't have to be a fisherman. You don't have to be anything but you, because that's who Jesus is calling to.